My name is Alyssa Archuleta-Stomack, and I am a current UCLA law student. It is my pleasure to introduce Catherine Sandoval, who will guide us through a rich discussion with our distinguished speakers here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, and also gracias. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm from Los Angeles, from East LA and Montebello. It's always impressive to see so many people on a Saturday morning in the rain in Los Angeles, and also here for this important discussion here, but also the symposium on Latina futures. So I wanted to start by just saying a minute about why that's so important that we're talking about this in the context of Latina futures. There's a whole field of futurism. In fact, you can get a certificate as a futurist, so put it on your LinkedIn. But the whole field of futurism really has not, in my view, adequately included people of color, let alone women of color, let alone Latinas, right? To the point that you look at even the comic book world and you wonder, did we survive into the future? And remember when I was looking at the syllabus for Oxford University has a institute for the study of the future, and they're very interested, especially in game-changing issues like climate change. But one of the things that I noted was really completely absent from their discussion was any discussion at all about equity or inclusion or diversity. And so we also have to ask ourselves, when we look at the future, are we looking at a future that is a Dickensian future, that is a techno-driven dystopian future, or are we looking at an inclusive, sustainable, more equitable future that includes and features all of us? So communications is really critical to that, and I'll just say a few words of introduction. I am here in two roles. I am a board member of the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. We are a relatively small organization, although the second most popular federal government channel on YouTube. So if you want to find out more about what we do, look at Chemical Safety Board on YouTube. And one of the previous speakers was talking about, putting out what you do through visual media. So the Chemical Safety Board was created as an amendment to the Clean Air Act in 1990 after the terrible tragedy in Bhopal, where an American company, Union Carbide, had a release from some of the toxic chemicals that they were storing. They still don't know how many people died in that accident, but it was at least 20,000. And at least 3,000 people died in the first 10 minutes. And then there was another terrible accident in Mexico City at a petroleum plant, and then an accident in Ohio. And so there was a recognition that more needed to be done to prevent these types of incidents, which can kill workers, harm communities, damage property. And so the Chemical Safety Board investigates the root cause of these incidents and makes recommendations to prevent them. So among the recommendations often is improving communications, right? And improving communications before disasters, after disasters, making sure the communication is inclusive and reaches the gente who are affected. So one of the things that we have done pursuant to President Biden's executive order on environmental justice is also include information about the communities that surround these chemical and petrochemical facilities. And we are increasingly seeing incidents where the workers who are injured or killed are Latinos. But when we talk about policy initiatives, like UCLA here has a Latino data hub, information that is reported to the National Response Center doesn't include the race or ethnicity of the workers who are injured or killed. So it's been very difficult to trace exactly how many of our gente or different gente are being harmed by these incidents. So this is all relevant to our discussion about information and misinformation, because as we heard in the discussion of voting, and indeed I would say the discussion of everything, right, our ability to access communications is fundamental, right? And then how we access communications, who controls communications, right, is also changing. And in fact, when this session was developed, one of the topics that we did not address in the writing, which I would invite our panelists to address, or we can bring up in the questioning, is also going to be the influence of artificial intelligence and other bots, right? Because as much as we have had issues coming out of mergers, change of control, changes in the regulation, which allow for more communication of just a sole viewpoint, and then where we're also seeing a lot of misinformation as you then ramp that up through artificial intelligence and bots. The game really changes, and even our language changes about that. So we can talk a little bit more about that. So with that, I am also a law professor at Santa Clara University. I have taught communications law for 20 years and really got into this field because it is foundational, right, to our access to information, increasingly to our ability to connect with each other. But it has become really a funnel through which more and more services are delivered, right? And where you cannot fully participate in education, in health, in jobs, if you don't have access to communication. So this is why there's been so much emphasis on infrastructure to also reduce the digital divide. But then we have to also look at what's going on top of what we call the platforms, which are our various communications platforms, including the internet, but also, as we heard, radio and television continue to be important, and cable, satellite, wireless phones, and some of the issues with that, but also what we are seeing with the power of internet platforms. So I look forward to the rich discussion. We are very lucky to have three tremendous experts in this field, and some of them I've had the opportunity to meet before. We've met through little boxes this big on Zoom. It's wonderful to see them live and in person. So with that, I would ask each of you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and then we're going to ask each speaker to talk for maybe 8 minutes so we can set the table with their expertise. And then that'll take us through 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and conversation. So, Profesora Fatima, would you begin? Thank you.
Hola a todos, buenos días. ¿Me escuchan? Sí? Okay.
A little more,
Hi.
a little closer.
A little closer, okay. Hi, I'm Fatima Espinoza. I am an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky in Information Science and Technology. Originally from Honduras, I've been in the U.S. since 2005, so that makes 19 years now. My research focuses on the use of information and communication technologies by marginalized populations. I have worked with the cases of Honduras, the social movement that rose after the coup d'etat in 2009. I have worked on the case of Puerto Rican activists' recovery and their efforts at being more efficient and effective than FEMA after Hurricane Maria. And more recently, and other topics as well, but more recently on the COVID pandemic impact in Latinx people in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I use this type of case study methodology and participatory approaches that I will be advocating for today, probably. And yeah, that's my research, and that's a little bit about me. I have 2 cats also.
All right. We go to Profesora Katyal.
Hi. It's great to be here. Wow, it's just so wonderful to be in a room with so many women of color and people of color. It's just great. I teach at UC Berkeley in the law school. My work focuses on technology and civil rights. More recently, I've been writing about AI and its impact on minorities, and I'm just really excited to be here. Thanks so much.
Great.
And I have 2 children, not 2 cats. Sometimes I can confuse them with cats, and they happen to be in this very room, being very well behaved.
Nora?
I love holding mics. That's one of my things. I feel like Selena, so that's why I do it. I'm Nora Benavidez. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And I didn't think we would see many people given the rain. I am also from Los Angeles, and my dad grew up in Montebello. I didn't even know that we had this in common. But no one shows up in the rain. And so on my way here, I was thinking we would have only a handful of people. And it's so moving to see so many Latinas in a room. And I don't know about you, but how often do you see that? It's really, really something. And it's very moving. When I started out in law school, I remember there was one woman Latina lawyer that I knew. And she worked in transactional law, which is a fine path. But it presented so many disappointments for me. I never saw anyone that looked like me, spoke like me, spoke Spanish, had any kind of background that resembled mine or anyone on this panel or in this room. And so it's really quite something to behold that we are building this bench, and I think we are all committed to that, and it's wonderful to see all of you. I have been a civil rights attorney for about a decade now. When I started, I lived and worked in the South in Atlanta, Georgia, and I really cut my teeth as a litigator. I worked at the ACLU. I worked on free speech cases, police misconduct, voting rights, you name it, any kind of constitutional issue. And I came to the digital realm, if you will, looking at what happens online and how we are manipulated by what we see online, because it was happening in the immigrant communities I worked with. And people wrote to me and texted me, and they would say, I'm afraid to pick up my child because I think ICE might be at my child's school. Is that real or is it a lie? And so I came to these issues having years of litigation and client work, mostly on the civil rights side and human rights issues. And so it just sort of was this odd, spontaneous, and serendipitous thing that I fell into working on digital civil rights. And over the years, I have sued Donald Trump and won for his retaliation of speech that he dislikes. Worked on various free expression and free speech policy issues, the way that protesters of color primarily are targeted for their speech. We are seeing that play out again and again and again. And so I've been a practitioner. Given the panel makeup, I think it's important just to name that. Now, in my work at the nonprofit Free Press, I work on the ways that technology companies shape and curate our experiences and the way that affects our engagement in democracy. So I'm really eager to be here, and thank you so much to the wonderful panel. Thank you to everyone.
Gracias, gracias. So to get a little bit deeper into the work of our fabulous panelists, Profesora Espinoza Vasquez, can you start us off a little bit by maybe 6, 7, 8 minutes, your take on communications, misinformation, disinformation, key themes that we should be looking at?
Yeah, so specifically, I was told that it would be important to have a conversation about the implications of what we're calling digital transformation, right, that we have been experiencing over the last couple of decades, and the concerns that that has for our democracy and our democratic processes. So from my perspective as a social researcher, I see this phenomenon as what we call socio-technical, right? It means that it's as technical as it is social, right? And when we think about this phenomenon, it's important to identify the forces, the social forces as well as the technical forces within the phenomenon. So when we think about the digital transformation lately, it's important for us to think about the social values and the social infrastructure that we have, and what is the role of these values and infrastructure in how they shape the technologies and vice versa, right? And so one of the things that from my research I have observed is that as society, we hold values on information and communication technology as this all-encompassing solution. And I think these kinds of approaches that we take to technology or these ideas around technology need to be criticized, right? Need to be examined. We need to look at the policies, right, that shape the technical environment that we have, and that are often neoliberal, and that in the way they promote the widespread adoption and dissemination of these technologies. Then look at the for-profit imperative that is behind these technologies. And finally, look at also the influence of local leaders and communities that are still prevalent. In some cases, they hold the values that we want them to hold. In some cases, they don't, right? And also to look at the structural inequities. Having said that, now let's look at the technical capacities that we have, right? So what we call in information science affordances of the technology. What is the technology allowing us to do? What is the capacity that they have? So one of the things that I found in my research is that is this huge capacity to collect data, right? Also, another characteristic is the inequity that is embedded in these digital objects that we have, right? Because they always replicate the social aspects, right, of our society. And the increased capacity to actually automatically manipulate our information environment, right, through things like artificial intelligence and tools like bots, right, that we have seen in action. These bots, for example, are capable of influencing the actual structure of social networks, creating artificial clusters, creating boosting artificially the visibility of actors or ideas, and also empowering the influence of certain actors, right? And leaving to the side experts and journalists. The other thing that they are able to do is to amplify content from specific sources and evoke positive or very negative emotions, right, that drive polarization. So bringing these two things, the social and the technical aspect, we must think, do these open or close the political and institutional environment for participation, for Latina participation here in all Latin America. So what I found in my research is that, first of all, these characteristics have increased what we call information precarity, and is basically our vulnerability and our lack of support to access the correct type of information, right? That will help us move on day by day, and that will help us work around the vulnerabilities that we face as a minority. The other thing that, the other type of impact that these technologies have is that and the policies that they create a misalignment between the intention that the policies have, unfortunately. Even the policies can be well-intended, but if they have these values behind, they are misaligned with the needs of minoritized communities. It's also created a phenomenon called data colonialism, which is the appropriation of our data, our personal data, and extracting information and then selling it back to us, right? And all these things weaken our political discourse and our social structures. So technologies have high capacity to influence these actors and influence us and bolster certain actors in society. It also has the capacity to distort trust by artificially inflating the intensity of activity in the internet, and also ultimately undermine democratic processes by manufacturing the doubt and destabilizing common ground that is necessary for democratic societies. That's my contribution so far.
Gracias, thank you very much. Really appreciate your insights and your work. Professor Katyal?
Great, thank you so much. That was great. So It's just such an incredible pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you to talk about the topic of Latina futures and the focus on collective organizing. I want to focus in my talk on just building on what was just said about thinking a little bit more deeply about AI, innovation, and disinformation, and thinking about it as three different facets of a similarly kind of problematic strategy of managing information. And that this feeds into managing representations and disclosure, particularly with respect to kind of representing this force of minority women in voting and social media. And I think that it's fair to say we're at this really curious moment with today's current events. We face tremendous risks to democracy. We face tremendous risks to community. And we also face increasingly risks to identity. And a lot of this stems from the fact that we're in a world where both deep fakes and fake news are apparently widely circulated, and they are aided with our own kind of cognitive biases. And I think that in many ways, the conflicts that we face today are conflicts about representation and truth and justice, but they're also driven in no small part by this kind of underlying dependency that I think many of us have built, perhaps unwittingly, in terms of our dependency on social media and even advertising. And so these turn out to be situations where things that are meant to be sort of commercialized, marketed to a consumer, have incredibly political repercussions, incredibly political effects. And this is only going to be amplified in an era of AI, and how that will affect the lives of minority women. I think in many ways, putting at stake how important it is to secure Latina representation and participation. So let me start with just one example that I think shows us how the dependence on technology and social media comes with these kinds of social welfare concerns. So in 2016, kind of building on the point that was made earlier about tech and profit, a 2016 report revealed that Facebook used algorithms to determine users' ethnic affinity, right? And that this term, ethnic affinity, could only be understood really as a euphemism for race. And the categories, as they were designed, actually allowed advertisers to exclude users with certain ethnic affinities from seeing their ads. And so after initially defending this as like a positive tool to allow users to see more relevant ads, they finally realized how truly illegal this was, right? And removed the categories for housing, credit, and employment, right? Because these are all areas that were represented and protected by the law 3 months later. And they realized that this desire to kind of generate more choices for the advertiser also fed into this risk of discrimination. And so as one person said, you don't know as a Facebook user what you're not seeing. And what you're not seeing is often a function of what population group you've been classified as: gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. And this extends to politics. So since algorithms tend to show users content that affirms their existing beliefs, within these filter bubbles, fake news flourishes. And so this raises, I think, a really significant kind of parallel concern between civil rights and artificial intelligence, which is that if predictive choices are driven by private preferences, then AI enables us to make even greater choices on a macro level about how entire demographics can be affected by AI. So this makes it all the more important that we focus on how the relationship between AI and injustice can play out, both commercially as well as politically. And particularly in terms of thinking about the incredible opportunity for Latina leadership in tech and social media. So studies have shown that Latinas are one of the most diverse, the most engaged groups of content creators with tremendous cross-platform presence and loyal followings in travel, health, personal finance, tech, home decor, gaming, branching out into new and powerful ways to generate political impact as well. So Forbes has reported that while the Latinx population makes up only 19% of the US population, only 6% of the marketing strategies investment is spent on reaching this community. And so just as an example, out of 1,900 brands that invest in English language television advertising, only 400 of them use Spanish language messaging to reach Latinx consumers. And so this, I think, is a good example of how data feeds into representation. Technology offers us a way of reducing people to a set of fixed data points. And this misses the complexity of the critique, right, that could be offered from advertisers either reaching out in extractive ways or not reaching out, right, in ways that I think overlook the power of communities. So I'd encourage us to think about technology and social media and its effects, and think about these kinds of categories, not just as categories of critique, but also categories of opportunity. So let's take TikTok, for example. 1 out of every 5 adult users of TikTok is Latinx identified. And Latinx identified communities are way more likely to use forms of social media than other groups. So if we overlook these statistics, we overlook the ways in which we can build better, collective, meaningful political participation. And this, I think, affects how we might think about enabling communities to access more information. It feeds into what we think of when we think of pictures of what a consumer looks like, what a political activist looks like. And by missing these opportunities, I think we actually risk creating another form of kind of passive disinformation. And this disinformation, I think, comes not necessarily from intention, but from having data that is incomplete and fails to represent the complexity of these communities. And so these applications, I think, these problematic sort of issues that come up with respect to data analytics, I think they require us to think broadly about how to address issues of inequality and discrimination on a digital age, in a digital age. So we can start with the point that was made earlier about infrastructure, and then we can think about the valuable critiques that we could make about socio-technical systems. And the other thing that's really important for us to kind of think more deeply about is the fact that the government, particularly in this day and age, is not really in a position to protect us from the risks of private companies and social media. So this leads us to ask this kind of fundamental question, which is, do we have to redefine what we think of as technology, or do we have to redefine what we think of as civil rights law to address the kind of technology-related issues that are going to come up in civil rights in the future? And so before we kind of open up some of these points more deeply, I want to just leave us with one other theme to think about, and that is the notion of personhood and personal dignity. The idea that we all have something powerful, right? Something that gives us this rich and complex notion of personhood, of intersectionality. And we have to return to these concepts, I think, in a fundamental rights framework, one that focuses not just on the kind of political rights and possibilities when it comes to building more collective mobilizing in the Latina population, but also about thinking about other different nexuses. So Latinas as consumers, interests of consumer privacy, interests of consumer due process, interests of consumer equal protection. And I think that it is through technology and the critiques of technology that we can harness an even greater power among minority women, but only if we summon the optimism. It's kind of appropriate that we're in the optimist room, right? To believe that this is possible. So I look at this room and I feel tremendous optimism about the future. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias to all the members of the Optimist Club here. So one point I wanted to follow up on, Professor Katyal, is your remarks make me think what's new is comes from what was old and never good in the first place. I worked for several years at the Federal Communications Commission, and we developed a study called "When Being Number One Is Not Enough." And it documented the practice that was prevalent in radio and in television, where they had what they called no urban or no Spanish dictates. that meant that no matter the ranking of the station, right? So like you could be in Washington, D.C., the number one station, number one radio station, actually number 1, 2, and 3 these days, is an urban station, which is another code for African-American oriented station. Although these days, a lot of places urban is mixed. I say that like in places like here, like Los Angeles, when we talk about marketing to the general market, okay, 3/4 of the people of Los Angeles are people of color, so we are the general market, right? But these dictates also said that if the audience or the programming was targeted towards urban audiences or in Spanish, no matter what the rating, no matter how high their ranking, we would not advertise. And actually, an advertising executive gave me one. So I have a piece of paper that was from a very famous bicycle company, and they wanted to do an ad for their bicycles in the Washington, D.C. market. And right at the bottom, it says, "No urban dictate." Right? So you think about Washington, D.C., which is the most affluent community of African origin in the world, right? And this company, which I guarantee you all have heard of, would not advertise their bicycles to be sold. And so here we are again, right? Where so the after many years and after much debate, after that study came out, the FCC actually outlawed that practice. So it's in some of the decisions that they banned no urban and no Spanish dictates, and also the practice of what they called minority discounts, where if your format served people of color, you also got paid less for your ads. And so these are some of the insidious practices that then create the infrastructure of lesser capital and is part of the reason why we're not served. But then here, this same practice you find is now embedded into the algorithms in a way that is even less transparent, although some people at Facebook apparently knew about it and however it came out. But, happy to hear that they stopped that, but curious about whether or not others have, right? Because this is one example we have to be careful about this type of insidious discrimination that is just moving from one media to another and is really, again, undergrounded by the technology, but, rooted in longstanding social views. So, wow, thank you. All right, so Abogada Benavidez.
Thank you so much. It feels like a perfect segue from Sonia's comments, which were incredibly evocative. I feel this panel in many ways sets out in its framing to define the problems. And we are in what I feel is a problem definition era right now of people, all of us, trying to grapple with and convince others, depending on the sector, that these are real issues. What both Fatima and Sonia were describing were the sort of boundaries, of like, here is what technology is doing to real people. And that's actually happening. I feel I live in a kind of Groundhog Day that much of my job is telling the same thing over and over again, that, yep, in fact, Black, Latino, Native American voters were micro-targeted on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram in the 2020 election. Yep, that happened in 2022. Here is what that content looks like. Here is the underlying sort of incentive that companies behave with, and they profit from extracting our data, leveraging it, placing us into cohorts. That's my job all the time. And as you've heard from these other wonderful speakers, we're really good at defining the problem. One of the issues is convincing people that it is a real problem. And so what I hope to do in my 6 minutes is share with you and invite you to become one of the spokespeople, because currently we are in a minority. that won't always be the case. And so we need more emissaries and we need more spokespeople who can and want to describe these stakes, because these are very real stakes. I call 2024 a year for democracy if we can protect it. More than half of the entire world will vote this year. Elections are already underway in other countries. And yet there are gross asymmetries across technology companies where they do not moderate content in other languages. English is sort of the supreme language. And so whether it's people in this room who look like you and me, or it is people in other countries who are swept up in manipulation and information warfare, there are global stakes. And I feel we would be remiss if we only talked about ourselves and the future of Latinas in this room or in this country. And so the stakes are huge. I don't want to make this my authoritarian or anti-authoritarian stump speech. That's the moment we are in. We are having to define the problem over and over and over again. What I love about my job when I don't have to just define the problem is that I get to work on solutions. And so that's the other thing I want to invite you to consider is how you plug in and how you get excited about solutions. Because the worst thing about information warfare and the manipulation online that we are all part of is that it makes us feel powerless. It makes us feel like maybe it's just me and Sonia disagreeing and no longer can see eye to eye, or that one of you suddenly feels estranged and alone from your family and your friends. These are by design systems to alienate and annihilate us from each other. So we're not more divided than ever, but we are confused, and this chaotic information environment leads us to feel there are no solutions, but there are. And it's an innovative arena that's very exciting. Innovation is also risky, and I know Latinos, we steer away sometimes from risk, but I invite, again, you all to consider how you become part of the solution. Some of what I work on is innovative legal arguments on how to litigate these issues. One case that I've worked on, Vargas v. Facebook, was exactly as Sonia described, a case in which a Latina woman observed that on her own Facebook, she didn't see the same ads that a white friend of hers did. And so they sat together, and I'm pretending, of course, Sonia's my white friend. And so we're looking, and Sonia's feed looked very different than Vargas, the plaintiff. And the case, though, was really difficult because how do you prove what you can't see? Yeah. The woman who was the plaintiff, a Latina woman, couldn't show, here, look, this is the opportunity I'm not getting, because it wasn't there. And so part of what these amazing litigators have worked on is thinking about how do you create the arguments from a legal perspective that the absence of evidence of discrimination doesn't preclude you from suing a tech company. And so we've worked for years on this case. I am only one of a larger team of legal experts that are working on how you work around what is called Section 230, the liability of tech companies and the way that they are currently shielded from liability. So there are innovative legal arguments being thought up and tested across the country on a number of issues here. That is one way to plug in. I think another is through policy, and policy takes a long time. It takes about a decade for a single type of issue to become a policy. But as you've heard from our other speakers, the way that our data is collected and analyzed, stored, and even sold is one of the primary ways that then all of us are micro-targeted, the way that we are placed into cohorts that lead to the kind of litigation that I just mentioned. And so of the lowest hanging fruit types of solutions here are to rein in the extractive data practices of private companies, and to rein in how governments can use and buy data about all of us, where protesters go, where people go to worship, if you go to an abortion clinic, et cetera. And so limiting the data collected about us gives people, all of us, more agency, gives us the kind of ability to participate in democracy. And I think there's one other solution I want to talk about, which I don't work on, but I work closely with, as Kathy mentioned at the top, futurists and technologists, the people that are dreaming up what platforms and what communication should and can look like to serve us, not the kinds of stuff that we passively just use. We use Twitter or X because it's there. But what would it look like to build systems and build communities online that really serve us and are made by us, used by us, and get us excited about the ways we want to connect? So I think of these as sort of the pillars of our future and how we address what democratic participation can look like. Every moment we have to fight the feeling of being siloed, of being annihilated. And I think these women here have done such a tremendous job describing how that works, the systems that undergird that kind of oppression. And every day, part of what I'm committed to, and I invite you to be committed to, is working on these issues and building the bench of those that come after you, so that you are never just the second or the third in line, but there is a long line after you coming forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
So I just wanted to contribute, thank you so much. In terms of solutions, there's initiatives going on out there. There are also, and this is based on the participatory methods that I talked about earlier. There are people going out back to the communities and engaging the communities and working with stakeholders in creating alternative infrastructures, right? And I call it alternative socio-technical infrastructures that actually work for them and that are driven by the community. So I am getting hopeful as well as I see these infrastructures in place. They take quite some work and they take a lot of face-to-face interaction, right? And engaging the old-fashioned way. But these kinds of initiatives are happening. Just wanted to add that, yeah.
And just to build on that point about infrastructures, I was listening yesterday to a discussion about building the middle mile infrastructure in California, which are the long internet carriage components of the physical internet infrastructure to increase service to unserved and underserved areas of California, rural as well as urban, suburban, and exurban, including places occupied by a diverse range of people. And in California, Senate Bill 156, one of the speakers mentioned, flipped the priorities and made the priority ending the digital divide instead of continuing the market-based priority of maximizing return on investment. So that's what gets to some of the political science theory that Professor Espinoza Vasquez is especially talking about, right, which is rooted in social technical values, right? Neither of these infrastructures nor the law grew out of the ground. Right? They're all created by human beings, but at the same time, they become embedded, right? And invisible embedded infrastructures that organize society. So years ago, I had the opportunity to teach communications law at UC Berkeley, and I remember one student asked me, he said, you keep talking about this digital divide thing and the haves and have-nots, and he said, I just don't see why it's a problem, because everywhere I go on the Berkeley campus, I have access to the internet. So, which, like, you see the framing problem, it's all about me. And so I said, well, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear Berkeley has great internet. Tell me about what happens when you go outside of the Berkeley campus and into the city of Berkeley. Do you have internet absolutely everywhere in the city of Berkeley? Oh, no, there are some cafes, and if I go there, they have terrible internet, and so I never go to certain cafes, so it's a little spotty. And I said, okay, how about in neighboring Oakland? Do you have great internet when you go to Oakland? He said, I don't go to Oakland. Okay. So, and yesterday I just heard that in Oakland, For some reason, they have the highest level of charges for middle mile infrastructure, which means even if you want to build a network to really increase service to homes and businesses in underserved area of Oakland, you are going to get some of the highest charges in the state to access that infrastructure. It makes no sense. This is like being right here off of the 405. They're in the middle of this urban corridor, right? But it is really a legacy of exclusion that has become embedded into the infrastructure and then gets perpetuated through pricing, right? That, we need to follow up on. So I'm seeing 1 minute. Is that 1 minute until we begin discussion? Q&A. All right, great. So, am I just recognizing people? We have cards. What are we doing?
We have the cards, and we can go down either side if you left them.
Okay. Okay, we got a few cards, but I think there's a few hands while we're getting cards, so.
I'm Sonia Katyal, and I'm dealing with shadow banning, and I'm being locked out. I'm running for assembly, so I have my own shadow banning issues, and it's very difficult.
Can you define shadow banning?
Shadow banning is if, say, you have your family on your social media, you don't even see them, and you're blocked, and you only can see so many things on your feed, and it's ridiculous. I can't even communicate. But what happened to me is they said I was adding too many people at once. And then they said, well, your number's being used for multiple accounts, so we're going to lock you down yet. And then, would you like to appeal this? So in the appeal process, I was locked out of the appeal process. Oh my God. So this is very serious. And also, because I had another social media account, and there is a digital footprint, it's called the Wayback Machine. My entire digital history was erased off that. That's because I'm very serious about the items that I'm moving forward. And on my webpage, which is SophiaForAssembly.com, I talk about AI, and for our risk, my concern with AI is as a patient. We can die, and people die because AI has determined you cannot leave the hospital. So there are a lot of issues, but I don't have an ego battle, but I'm too busy running a campaign. They're just trying to stop the traction and the movement that we're trying to move forward. So we don't have anything to go to. We don't have a place to go to deal with these issues of AI. And even within the FCC, I attended those hearings. We had issues because we had electrical fires. So they didn't do the upgrade, and everything's burned. But what I also saw under the FCC is they were targeting Black and brown communities to do the Wi-Fi, where in white communities they were doing the fiber optics, which is quicker, safer, and so that's another racial equity issue.
Nora, you had a comment?
Yeah, I know we don't have a lot of time. I mean, shadow banning is one of the issues I work on quite a bit, and part of that is at the micro level for each of us, it's horrible to think that we are being shadow banned in the case of Palestinian and pro-Israel content on platforms right now. Everyone feels they are being shadow banned. That very likely may be the case. And much of what we've seen so far is several platforms have downranked political content generally, just across the board. So the bigger underlying issue, though, is the opacity of these companies, and that if you're being shadow banned or if another person is being shadow banned, whatever the content might be that you're trying to get out there, there is no way to prove it. Which doesn't mean it isn't happening. And when other civil rights and tech accountability activists, experts go to meet with tech companies, we say, can you show us virality reports? Can you show us, what do you do when content seems like it's violating a policy? What is your process? Who reviews that? Is it first automated systems that review that and then humans? Is it being reviewed in language, or is it in translation? Is it by moderators that speak the language and are local and understand the local context? When something feels like it's the squishy gray area of maybe violative, do you downrank it? Do you, when you come across content that feels like someone has rapidly added people, what are your processes? And we don't get answers. And so the opacity of these companies, the lack of transparency, the lack of disclosures that they provide is one of those issues that we are looking at through policy solutions, which can't be the only. We have to also have upward pressure on these tech companies. But it is a very real phenomenon, and it is happening across the board, across countries everywhere, where political dissidents are being downranked because governments are encouraging and pushing that tech companies do that. There are a lot of tentacles to this issue. And what it makes people feel, as I said earlier, is that kind of dissociated, siloed thing, that you can't even get your voice out, you can't even be seen or heard.
Thank you. Well, we have so many questions here. I'm attempting to categorize them, so I'm not going to be able to ask all of these questions. So I'm going to ask some buckets of questions, if that's okay. So one of the points was related to the report the Department of Justice just issued on the failed response to the active shooter in Uvalde. Yeah. And one of the points in that report was about misleading or incorrect information released by officials, and how do we improve the communication. So this is one of the issues that I'm also working on in my official role at the Chemical Safety Board is emergency communication, disaster communication and response, and preparation. So there's this whole idea about disaster response called the whole community approach, that you have to include the whole community in preparation for disasters, and it really goes back farther to that, to these zoning decisions, to these infrastructure decisions, to these resource decisions, right? Because if we don't include the whole community, you're going to have the wrong approach to begin with. I think we would all agree that the whole community is not adequately included in preparation, but then you have instances like this where miscommunication made a disastrous situation even worse. And so many of the children who were lost were also Latino. So does anyone have any comments on the role of communication and in disaster preparation and response?
So I'm trying to organize myself. In terms of disaster and preparation response, what I've learned is that the marginalized communities, especially when it's the infrastructure that is collapsing, right? There's some sort of infrastructure that is collapsing. What I learned is that marginalized communities don't intend to reconstruct that infrastructure because it was marginalizing them in the first place, right? And from my research, I've seen that what helps the most is the strong and the weak ties that people have with their communities, and that's what allows them to create better response. And of course, there are so many different types of disasters, right? And this is a generalization, but basically, yeah, from my experience, marginalized communities are not looking forward to reconstruct that infrastructure. They want something new, and that's why they create this alternative means of addressing their problems through information, subversive practices, and new repertoires of contention online and also in person.
Free Press, my organization, worked quite a bit when the shooting occurred to document and speak out on the hate that was on platforms that flourished and was allowed to flourish, leading to the shooting, and what a climate of hate does online. In response more broadly to the DOJ report, I think there's sort of a question around incentives. Was there incentive for a local government to get the facts right? And I think there wasn't, because they felt that the communities affected didn't matter as much. So it's a question not just then of incentive, but of equity and of justice. And
all the press conferences in English.
Exactly. And so there's one, local government and anyone tasked with crisis communications has to anticipate that crises occur. That's their job. That's what moderators are tasked with doing at platforms. That's what local government has to be able to anticipate and plan for. And that's a separate panel, frankly, crisis communications and disaster preparedness in these contexts. But those things are anticipated and they are expected, and there are scenario planning sessions that happen. I have sat in on those with tech companies and mapped out what happens when we go through various coup attempts, when we go through other types of situations. So the fact that it occurred only points to that there wasn't a lack of preparedness, there was a lack of care. And that is a fundamental negligence because we are not seen as mattering as much.
So one topic that we've touched on a little bit was about data privacy law. And so a speaker mentioned Washington State enacted a data privacy law. California has a form of data privacy law. I would add the European community has very robust data privacy laws that we have not adopted here in the United States. So can any of you speak a little bit to not so much, I would say not so much the future for, are we going to adopt a federal data privacy law? Because that also depends on the elections about whether or not you can do that. But the importance of data privacy and how we can address it both in terms of new laws, state laws, user behavior, lawsuits, other tactics.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that just kept coming up for me as our incredible speakers talked about is the way that we can kind of hold the critique of technology while we recognize that many of us are dependent on technology, right? And I think that like one way that we can think of that as a sort of index for optimism is to hold the critique of technology, to really understand what it means to be protective and outspoken about your data privacy. One thing that I just kept thinking about in this room is, as Fatima was speaking, the value of data trusts, right? The idea that you can build a community that is responsible for kind of shepherding and protecting data, that can be thoughtful about when things are shared and when things are not. And I think that could be something to think about. I also do think that like this is really a sort of ground up effort, I think, in many ways. Like we have to show tech companies that we care about our data, that we care about when we are marketed to, how we are marketed to, what is being said about us when we are not in the room, right? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we have to be very clear about. And right now, it seems to me from where I sit in Berkeley, tech companies say, oh, everyone cares about their privacy, but they're always willing to just check the box and share their data. And I think we have to make it clear that we're not, right? That the risk of extraction is too great at this moment.
I work every day on data privacy, so there's a lot to say and there isn't time. I'm happy to speak with anyone afterwards about the state of play. A little over 12 states in the United States have passed some form of data privacy protection, and others are now in the works. Within that huge world of protecting people and limiting what companies, private companies of any sort, not just tech companies, can collect about us, there are ways that can be done wrong and done better. And at this current moment, I am not fully optimistic, but very hopeful that before our next president is inaugurated, there is a federal data privacy and AI-related bill that passes. But I believe that's only possible if literally all of us all the time are engaging and writing to our members of Congress, which again feels like a drop in the bucket maybe, but it isn't. And I work with and I meet with these members of Congress and their staff every week. And when they hear from people, it actually makes a difference. So all of our wonderful pontificating about the issues, like these are very real things you can be doing, and they actually have an impact. And if you set an alarm for yourself, a reminder every week to write to your member of Congress about the specific reasons that you in your identity and what you want, care about and want a federal privacy law, that would make a difference. And those in California in particular, because California's law is a way to circumvent. Many federal elected officials feel that is enough. And what we need to show is that it isn't enough for just kids to be protected, or for just Californians, or just Oklahomans to be protected, but for everyone to be protected. There should be a federal floor, and that everyone gets that floor of protection, and then we build up from there.
Is there a bill?
There is a bill. It has not been reintroduced, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. ADPA, or ADPPA, is the acronym. It was introduced and it passed almost unanimously out of a subcommittee when it was introduced, with overwhelming bipartisan support. So the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, it must get reintroduced, it must pass the full House, and I have my fingers crossed, given that I work on it every day, but we really do need the kind of communities around us to support and speak out.
And there's also an AI bill, so although that's also kind of in a limbo state.
Yeah, there are, I mean, I don't think we have time.
Yeah, there are several
There's so
AI
many
bills.
AI-related bills, and
Right.
ADPPA does address some of those, the ways that data is then leveraged by companies that use it to inform their algorithms and other automated systems.
Right. And AI certainly makes data privacy even more urgent. So if any of you are doing work with AI, just realize whatever you put into it can become part of the AI database. So you don't want to put sensitive information. I think we should also resist the claims of AI, oh, well, the program is just engaging in confabulation or hallucination. It is making things up, right? And doing stuff in a way that, like, you know, over and over again, people have asked AI, okay, do images of CEOs. Okay, what do you get? A gallery of all white men. Okay, like Mary Barra doesn't exist. All the Latinas who own all kinds of businesses, we don't exist. But and it's not even just that they're not drawing from the small business database. There aren't enough Mary Barras, you know, to make it move the algorithm. And so, again, this gets back to our theme of Latina futures, right? And to build an inclusive future, and we've said over and over again, Nora has reminded us that we're also here to deepen the bench, so we'd like to invite you to share information. You had so many great questions, and sorry we weren't able to get to them, but I'm sure that we'd also invite follow-up dialogue, and we'd like to thank UCLA for convening all of us. Gracias.
Thank you again to our fabulous panel for an insightful dialogue, and thank you to all for your engagement in this discussion and great questions. As a reminder, if you are eligible for MCLE credit, you can sign up at the table outside. And we are now transitioning into our Latina Lawyer Bar Association networking lunch. Thank you.